Church family, welcome to Bible Class at the Park, where we're going to dive in today into chapter 8 of the story titled A Few Good Men and Women. And this chapter 8 of the story here is, in our Bibles, is the section of the Book of Judges. And all I want to do today is just simply give an overview to help us understand where in the story we are and what's happening, because the Book of Judges is a tough read. Now there's some great stories. You know, we've pulled some VBS stories from the Book of Judges, which after today we may reconsider. But there's some notable names that we look at in the Book of Judges. But the Book of Judges, what we need to look at, it's always incredibly important as you look at Scripture to look at and to understand literary style. And the literary style of the Book of Judges is really written like a tragedy. There's not a happy ending in the Book of Judges. There's a bunch of decline and decline and decline and corruption and corruption and corruption. There's, it's a bit of a roller coaster. There's some high points in it, but what we see is just it's a continued, the trajectory of the whole thing just goes down and down and down. So look at the Book of Judges as a tragedy, first of all. So I just want to give just a real general overview of what's happening in the Book of Judges, just to help us understand the full big picture and where it points from here, because in that there is the glimmer of hope that we find here in the Book of Judges is at the very, very end, and we'll get to that in just a second. Judges starts off by highlighting the fact that Israel had not taken captive in all the cities or taken control of all the cities that God had given them. They had not driven the Canaanites out of the land as God had commanded them. God ready to give the Canaanites into their hands, but they had failed to do so. If you remember last week, the story that Mitch shared, the illustration that Mitch shared about Israel taking Canaan, the promised land, is that the square mileage that God promised them was like promising them Texas. And what Israel actually went in and actually claimed and occupied was more like New Jersey. Now, no disparaging on Texas or New Jersey there, but the main point is that Israel left so much on the table for what God had promised them. That's something I've been thinking about all week. Wow, what are we leaving on the table that God is promising us? God is ready to just give us all that we need so that we can be a blessing to others. But there's so much of what God has promised us that we're just not living into. So that's such a powerful lesson that we can take just from this first chapter, really. This first section of Judges. And Judges chapter 2, it mentions that Joshua, who had led them in, Joshua and all of his generation had died. So they were still trying to please the Lord at this point, not doing great, but they were trying, they had a godly leader. Joshua and his generation died, and the Israelites forgot the Lord and served the Baals. Basically just assimilated to worshiping the gods of the people around them and adopting the customs and traditions of the people around them. And God spent some time and gave the Israelites into the hands of these, so that's a phrase we use all the time, gave them into their hands, allowed the Israelites to be taken over, didn't go and fight for them in these moments. Israel had completely forgotten about God, was not crying out to him, was not praying to him, was not worshiping him. God gave them over to the hands of the raiders, of the people that were coming in to take over and to fight them and battle them and occupy their space and their land and take their things and marry the women and just be a part of kind of take over. But then God raised up judges. Now, we need to understand that this is not our courtroom version of a judge. We can think of the way I heard this put. I would recommend going to watch the Bible Project's recap of the story of Judges. It's really helpful. And the way they describe it is these judges were more like tribal chieftains. Like they were regional political military leaders. These judges were. And so God would raise up a judge, and that judge would either do right or do wrong in the eyes of the Lord. And based on that, Israel would gain success or defeat based on the attitude, the actions, and the how the judge followed God. And man, we see over and over and over. There's 12 judges that are mentioned. That may be a notable thing to just jot down on your margins there. 12 judges that were mentioned in the book of Judges, and you see it just kind of all goes downhill. So these judges starts with Othniel, then Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, Gideon, Tola, Jair, Jair. I'll let you decide how to pronounce that. Jephthah, and we'll come back to him in a second. Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, and our boy Samson. All God has to work with, and his promise to keep his promise to fulfill his covenant, to bring back his people, to get his people back, to remain in covenant with his people. All he has to work with are these broken leaders, and he does work through them as kind of either rotten or just scared as they may be. Gideon gets a lot of press. Gideon starts off incredibly fearful. We find him, first of all, hiding in a wine press. He's threshing wheat in a wine press because the Israelites at that time, they were hiding from all the surrounding enemies. They were scared and they were hiding. They were not being bold followers of God, believing that God would fight for them. So they're hiding, and that's where we find Gideon. And then Gideon needs all this kind of proof of are you really going to do this, God? I really need you to really promise me. Really, are you sure? Help me understand. Help me believe. And then he does something interesting with Gideon. Is he walks him to a place where he's going to understand that there's no way other than God's help that he gained his victory. Gideon starts off going up against the army he's going up against with 32,000 men. God says, that's too many. I will not send you all up. If I send you up, you will win and you will think you did it by your own strength. So I'm going to cut down your numbers. From 32,000 to 300. He cuts them down over a series of events and kind of filters he runs them through. 300 men go and defeat the enemy. Sometimes it's not only just unfortunate events that happen in our lives, and God is with us in the unfortunate events that unfortunately happen to us. They're hard, but yes, God is with us. What we see here is that sometimes God walks us to a place that is difficult in order to show us that he truly is in control and that he truly is fighting for us and working for our benefit and offering us hope and salvation. So we see this, it's a pattern we see over and over, and we see this here with Gideon. I'm going to walk you to a place that's going to be difficult for you. If you're in a difficult situation, it may not just be the series of unfortunate events that have gotten you there. Consider that God might be walking you there to show you something, to teach you something, to form you into the person that he's going to bring out of that place to accomplish his will in a most powerful way through you. God walks with us through those places, and sometimes he leads us to those places. We see that all throughout Scripture. Then I want to skip a couple judges. The story of Jephthah is super interesting. This is chapter 10 and 11 and into 12 of the book of Judges. Jephthah is going up against Amnon, and Jephthah prays to God. So there's a good start. He's recognizing God. So let me read just for a minute from Judges chapter 11, verse 29 following. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. He crossed Gideon and Manasseh, passed through Mizpah and Gilead, and from there advanced against the Ammonites. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, if you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. Interesting promise he makes here. And this totally fits in with the literary style of tragedy, because maybe he's thinking that the first thing that's going to come out of his home in the type of culture they're in, it'll be a goat, or it'll be some sort of a animal that will be around, or maybe it could be worse than that in his mind, but who knows what he's thinking. But what happens when he gets back home is his own daughter walks out to greet him. And he believes himself to be stuck in that promise he made to God. His daughter convinces him to wait and let her to go through the hills with her friends and mourn for a few months. And she does so, and she comes back, and he fulfills his vow, and he sacrifices her. What's interesting to know is the Canaanites are known for a few different things. One of the things they're known for is just kind of corruption all around. But the way that they worship their gods, one of the things they are known for, and the ways they worship their God, is through child sacrifice. And so this deal that Jephthah makes with God, maybe it seems like a bold declaration of faith in God, maybe, but he's starting to treat God as if Yahweh God, Jehovah God, Creator God, he's treating them as if he's one of the Canaanite gods, and that's how he needs to be appeased. So the Israelites during this time they go back and forth, forgetting God and remembering God, forgetting God and remembering God, but through all this they've completely lost the character of God and who he is and who he has called them to be. And so this tragic deal that he strikes with God and upholds, God never calls for. But Jephthah upholds this because he thinks that's how you appease a God, which is incredibly tragic. And we see that the tragedy and the corruption and the sinful nature that's kind of baked in now to the lives of almost all of Israel. And the Judges goes all the way through Samson. Yeah, Samson defeats the enemies, sure, but Samson is not a role model. I, I want to be really careful how we portray him, because God uses broken people. And wow, is Samson an example of that? All God has to work with are these broken leaders, and he does work through them. But they are broken people, which maybe is encouraging for us. That it doesn't matter how broken you are, God can work through you. Okay, and God will work through you. And then the last section of the book of Judges, the last couple chapters, is Israel descending not only into assimilating their culture and their worship with the surrounding communities and cultures and nations and their pagan worship, but now they've descended into civil war against themselves. The Benjaminites become a problem, and there's a battle, and there's a war there's a civil war that breaks out. So things are as bad as they can get for God's people. It seems that they're as bad as they can get. But there's a phrase at the very end of Judges that is worth recognizing, and has baked into it a tiny glimmer of hope, or it's at least worth paying attention to. This last sentence of the book of Judges says this: "In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit." Israel had no real leadership. These judges were raised up and then fell, and raised up and fell, raised up, died, God forgotten, God raised up another judge, God's remembered, the judge dies, God's forgotten. The story happens over and over and over. And now they descend into civil war. And the last sentence is, in those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as he saw fit. Interesting to me why he says Israel had no king. There's not much talk about kings at this point. Judges had been raised up, but Israel had no king. But we see that this is not the end of the story. So what this does is continues to point us forward to maybe something's going to happen that's going to bring us a king. Look at the very first couple of verses, not first verse of the very next book of the Bible, the book of Ruth. It's a teaser for later on. Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab." The last sentence says Israel had no king. And the next sentence starts to talk about there was a man from Bethlehem in Judah. Does that sound familiar? We're already starting to see Israel had no king, but there's a plan for a king. God's got a plan. Stick with God and watch him unfold this story as he continues to bring God's people back to him. And so we see in the book of Ruth we start to see hints of, and the story of King David start to be introduced. So that's just a teaser for down the road. The book of Judges is a tragedy, and it's a sort of a microcosm of the human condition, where we are on a roller coaster of our faith with God. God continues to try to bring us close to him and see us through and fight our battles for us. But we're so broken, and we're in need of a king. We're in need of a savior. And so we have little hints of that at the end of Judges that keep us engaged and keep us looking forward. And that's where we are in the story. Let's not, how to say this. let's be careful that our lives are not so tightly assimilating with the culture around us that maybe we don't forget who God is altogether, but maybe the character of God gets tainted, and now we no longer know how to really interact with him. Let's keep in the scriptures. Let's keep reading, keep following the story. As God reveals his nature and his character, we will see God as the one who has created us and who is fighting for us and who's going to save us through the King that's coming. Thanks for being with us today. Love you guys. Like always, if you have any questions or comments, you can reach out to me. There's a Connect card that's online, theparkchurchtulsa.org. We'd love to communicate with you any way we can, bless you any way we can. You guys have a great week. See you soon.